Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome. Wonderful to see all of you here tonight. I'm really excited about our speaker tonight, Jess Rao, the novelist and the author of his most recent collection of essays, White Flight's Race Fiction and the American Imagination. Jess is also the author of two short story collections titled The Train to Lo Wu and Nobody Ever Gets Lost. His novel, Your Face in Mind, I highly recommend to you. It's really an extraordinary book. It's been praised as smart, furious, brave, thought-provoking, and I really believe it is all of those things. His fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Plowshares, Granta, and it has been anthologized 3 times in the Best American Short Stories. He's won 2 Pushcart Prizes and a Penn O. Henry Award, and has received a number of fellowships, including a Guggenheim, an NEA Fellowship, and a Whiting Writers Award, as well as a Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant. I think that was for this book. Is that right? Yeah. In 2007, he was named a Best Young American Novelist by Granta. So please join me in giving a warm Chicago welcome to Jess Rao.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much to everybody at Chicago who had a hand in bringing me out here, Rachel DeWaskin and Adrienne Brown and Rachel Galvin. It was really nice to, it's just wonderful to be here. I've known Rachel and Adrienne a very long time. I've known Adrienne since she was my wife's compatriot in the Princeton PhD program, and Adrienne came there when she was, 22, 23?
Very young, yes.
Yeah, so my wife was much older, and she said, I have this classmate who's like barely even drinking age or something. It's like, I don't even know. She looks like she's about like 15 or something, and that was Adrienne. I've been reading Adrienne's work about race and real estate for a very long time, and I feel like even though, I feel like our sort of like my project and her project were sort of like linked, sort of indirectly in many ways, in the years and years that they were evolving. So I am gonna, and I should also say that my literary education was super stodgy. When in my 20s especially, when you said the University of Chicago, like I would automatically think of people like Norman MacLean and Wayne Booth and people from generations and generations ago. And so when I come here, like those are still sort of like those figures still very much haunt my thinking, and in many ways they haunt this book for sure. So I've never studied at University of Chicago. I've never really even walked around the campus, but in my mind it's played a very long shadow, and that's also not even thinking about Saul Bellow and the Committee for Social Thought and all the other aspects of the Chicago of yore, I guess you could say. So I'm going to read a little part of this book. I often ask the person I'm going to be in conversation with, so what part of the book should I read tonight? And Adrienne didn't give me any helpful. She said, I have questions about everything. Read anything, which is like, thanks for the guidance. So I'm going to read a section that I have not read before. So I'm going to read a part of this book that's about Annie Dillard. Anyone here familiar with Annie Dillard? I'm seeing some nods. Okay. So this is a section that's about her, and it focuses on her autobiography, which is called An American Childhood. It came out in 1990. And even the title itself is a racialized title, is an indicative title about how she's positioning herself vis-a-vis Americanness and childhood. Okay, so I'm just going to dive right in. Without wanting to, this is part of a section of an essay in the book called On Seeing, Waking, and Being Woke. Without wanting to, without knowing what wanting to would mean, virtually all American children eventually wake up to knowing they are seen as black, white, brown, Asian, Spanish, Indian, quote unquote. My colleague Piper Kendricks Williams calls the lineage of these stories in African American life epiphanal blackness. There is also such a thing as epiphanal whiteness, which begins in the most classic sense with a blissful state of innocence, an idyll. Wholeness, solidity, a shelter, a canopy, a nest, a house. The house as a chrysalis, as an extension of the womb. That which is, in other words, natural, whole, appropriate, fitting. Like any child, quote, like any child, I slid into myself perfectly fitted, as a diver meets her reflection in a pool, Annie Dillard writes in An American Childhood, quote, her fingertips enter the fingertips on the water, her wrists slide up her arms. The diver wraps herself in her reflection wholly, sealing it at the toes, and wears it as she climbs rising from the pool and ever after. The particular moment of childhood that Annie Dillard is describing is the age of 10, where, according to her, a certain kind of reflective consciousness emerges for the first time. Quote, they feel themselves to have just stepped off the boat, just converged with their bodies, to lodge in an eerily familiar life already well underway. When I read this passage, I think of myself swimming. I did a lot of swimming at the age of 10, in my own pool at home, in the lake at summer camp, in the muddy Patuxent River down the bluff from our house in southern Maryland. I remember learning to water ski that summer on the Patuxent and the feeling of letting go of the rope at the end of a run and sinking slowly on my skis into the water, which was so warm it hardly felt like water at all. I can do this feeling, this easeful kind of prose. And then I look again at the phrase, like any child. Dillard is proposing a homology, a perfect identification of the child and the child's reflection, that is, the way the child is reflected by the world. The diver wraps herself in her reflection wholly, she writes. For a white or white-appearing child in the United States, the smoothness of this transition makes perfect sense. The reflection I cast is also me. What occurs in nature is an obvious metaphor for what occurs inside me. In the same passage, Dillard writes, quote, consciousness converges with the child as a landing turn touches the outspread feet of its shadow on the sand. But this is manifestly not what happens with any child. The Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education was partly, but decisively, based on Kenneth and Mamie Clark's famous doll test experiments in the 1930s, which showed African-American children as young as 3 choosing to play with white dolls, identifying the white dolls as the ones most like themselves. This idea threads through American culture in any number of ways: imitation of life, invisible man, the bluest eye. In conventional literary language, to call a text imaginative writing or creative writing, privileging the faculties of creativity or the imagination, is to say that the writer is exempt from having to answer this kind of critique. Annie Dillard is not strictly speaking wrong in using the phrase like any child, in the sense that she could be legally wrong in saying, like any child, I had the right to own a firearm, or logically wrong in saying, like any child, I was a fan of the Boston Red Sox. When Tolstoy says at the beginning of Anna Karenina, happy families are all alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, no one accuses him of being an armchair sociologist. There's a special kind of declarative absolute in a work of fiction, or an essay, or a poem, that takes on a provisional status dependent on its context. When Dillard says, like any child, she's generalizing, broadening the circle of her own experience, her subjectivity. Is it useful as an observation to look at that act of generalization, that expansive gesture, and call it whiteness? Annie Dillard, someone might say, is not writing An American Childhood or any of her books in continuous conscious possession of a white identity. She's writing as a person, an individual, an observing imagination. Like any writer worth paying attention to, she has a highly distinctive, almost immediately identifiable presence on the page. She's best known for the qualities present in this passage: intimate, precise, elaborately metaphorical writing, often in the form of observations of minute objects, as in her essay, The Death of the Moth, and informed by an expansive sense of natural theology via Emerson and Thoreau. Her writing tends to be fiercely solitary and idiosyncratic. Eudora Welty, in an otherwise flattering review of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, voiced a common critique this way: Annie Dillard is the only person in her book, substantially the only one in her world. I recall no outside human speech coming to break the long soliloquy of the author. Speaking of the universe very often, she is yet self-surrounded, and beyond that, book-surrounded. Her own book might have taken in more of human life without losing a bit of the wonder she was after. Might it not have gained more? Given these conditions, it might be possible to say that focusing on Annie Dillard's whiteness is beside the point. Dillard is, as Welty puts it politely, antisocial. But an American childhood is not oblivious to race at all. Race and racism are palpable in it from the very point of origin. Dillard's father was a dissatisfied businessman with family money who loved Dixieland jazz and who once in New York was friends with a black drummer in a 52nd Street band named Zutty Singleton. When Dillard was a young girl, her father abruptly left on a months-long trip on a cabin cruiser from Pittsburgh, hoping to reach New Orleans. Quote, the big and muddy source of it all. In New Orleans, men would blow it in the air and beat it underfoot, the music that hustled and snapped, end quote. Then just as abruptly, her father gave up and returned to the family. For all his dreaminess, she writes, he prized respectability above all. At around the same moment of life, Dillard is playing with some Irish Catholic kids from a steep part of the neighborhood, and one of them tells her, go tell your maid she's an N. He repeated it, and I did later when I got home. That night, Mother came into our room after Amy was asleep. She explained and made sure I understood. She was steely. Where had my regular mother gone? Did she hate me? I was never to use such words, and never to associate with people who did so long as I lived. I was to apologize to Margaret Butler first thing in the morning, and I was to have no further dealings with the Sheehys. I had put myself in danger, Dillard writes. I felt at the time, for Mother was so enraged, of being put out, tossed out into the cold, where I would go crazy and die like a dog. Whiteness in scenes like this in an American childhood takes on a kind of heaviness, a metonymic weight. To be white in the way the Doak family was white, that's her family name, Doak, D-O-A-K. To be white in the way the Doak family was white, as benevolent, liberal, somewhat eccentric, non-practicing Presbyterian aristocrats, was to take on a weight of shame and grief along with noblesse oblige. When I write these words, shame and grief, I'm also referring to my own upbringing. I had an early experience of saying the same word and being punished for it, not at all unlike Annie Dillard's. I lifted this incident more or less straight from life and inserted it in my novel, Your Face and Mine. Quote, there's something else I forgot, or rather something else I can't remember. I can't remember what caused me to fight the boy. I was 7, we were at some school summer camp, not in Newton but nearby. He appeared out of nowhere, and like that we were grappling in the dust, the only fight I'd had in my life up to that time. He elbowed me in the shoulder, pushed me over, and walked off. I was blinded, howling. That N, I said, when my counselor picked me up, and he put me down immediately and pinned me against the wall by my shoulders. Don't ever say that again, he said. He had greasy shoulder-length black hair, a knobby nose, a Ziggy Stardust t-shirt fraying at the collar. You understand? Say it again and I'll beat the shit out of you myself. I'll fucking kill you, you understand? How is anyone supposed to understand? The default American term for talking about experiences like these is white guilt. Usually when a white person is accused of white guilt, the assumption is that the guilt is unjustified or misplaced. I didn't own slaves, and that it is immobilizing that the white person is being treated badly and won't respond because he or she feels too guilty. This has become a standard feature of conservative orthodoxy, but scorn for the guilty white liberal is by no means limited to conservatives. I think I first encountered this concept reading a collection of Doonesbury cartoons my parents had lying around the house when I was a child, in which one of Gary Trudeau's stock characters is bullied by Black Panthers demanding money for their free breakfast program. The guilty white liberal has become a standard American feature of comedies about race, too, from Spanglish to Soul Plane to Dave Chappelle's comedy routines. White guilt is a politically useful stereotype or caricature because it focuses attention on an imaginary absurdity. Guilt in the OED means, quote, the fact of having committed a specified or implied offense or crime. How can a person be declared guilty of a crime they did not commit? Annie Dillard describes herself as a child who didn't know what N meant, and I feel with her again the mysterious injustice of being hated by her own mother for having used a word in ignorance. Racism in this context, in a Presbyterian family, becomes associated with original sin, with predestination, and thus is wrapped up in that most fundamental American conflict, the struggle between Calvin and Rousseau, or Jonathan Edwards and Emerson, between knowing you are damned, a sinner in the hands of an angry God, or wretch, as Newton put it in Amazing Grace, and believing you can and will be born again in innocence, or better yet, that you always were innocent, that you are one with the fecundity of the landscape. I come from a family that was Unitarian in practice, but Calvinist in spirit, and it's difficult for me to let go of the idea that racism is America's original sin. The problem with viewing racism as sin is that it then becomes subject to epiphanic forgiveness and redemption. It becomes a personal failing, a transgression, which can and should be confessed, after which the sinner can return to innocence. Of course, because racism is not actually sin, not actually subject to the tribunal of the church, the process becomes murky and frustrating, the state of innocence almost never achieved. White guilt and its far more powerful counterpart, white innocence, as theory or theology or fantasy, is hugely destructive as a feature of American public life, and what makes it destructive, in part, is that it's not descriptive or accurate in practice. Guilt doesn't explain why Annie Dillard's father, Frank Doak, befriended Zutty Singleton in New York, or why he temporarily abandoned his family to follow Huck Finn down the river to New Orleans. It doesn't explain the intimate relationship between a young white girl and the middle-aged African-American woman, Margaret, who cares for her and who has known her since birth. It's an overlay in Dillard's way of thinking about race, but it doesn't describe the weight of race, the deep psychic wound of fundamental sadness, even grief, that is difficult or impossible to articulate fully. In his 1917 essay, Mourning and Melancholia, Freud drew a critical distinction between a healthy response to a traumatic loss, in which a person is able to mourn and then move on with life, and melancholia, in which a person returns again and again to the traumatic loss, unable to fully process it. A person trapped in the cycle of melancholia, Freud says, has confused the lost object with a part of his or her own self, with the ego. Once this happens, it's impossible for the melancholic person to transfer that attachment to any other object. The shadow of the object, as Freud puts it, exists within oneself in a kind of limbo, neither fully satisfying as something to be loved or fully unsatisfying as something that needs to be expelled. The worst part of melancholia, then, is the inability even to wish that the lost object would return. The melancholic person, as it were, has consumed the object. It has become part of that person's psyche. If the object reappears in the outside world, it is actually intolerable. This might sound abstruse and speculative if there weren't so many situations and narratives in American racial history that correspond to the same pattern. As Anne Chang puts it in The Melancholy of Race, quote, American national idealism has always been caught in this melancholic bind between incorporation and rejection. Like melancholia, racism is hardly ever a clear rejection of the other. Racist institutions, in fact, often do not want to fully expel the racial other. Instead, they wish to maintain that other within existing structures. Segregation and colonialism are internally fraught institutions, not because they have eliminated the other, but because they need the very thing they hate or fear. It is this imbricated but denied relationship that forms the basis of white racial melancholy. How is it possible to describe the ways American whiteness needs American blackness? It's such a fraught question, so simultaneously obvious and grievous, that it's hard to know where to begin. Enslaved Africans were commodified as labor, as the economic engine that created American capitalism as it is known today. In his recent book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Edward Baptist documents how the slave trade was intrinsic to the market economy that transformed luxuries into necessities and created patterns of consumption that still exist today. As enslaved people and as free laborers or servants, African Americans were also intimately intertwined with the lives of many white families, especially, but of course not only, in the South, as personal servants and caregivers, nurses, nannies. African and African American women throughout the entire history and prehistory of the United States have been subjected to the sexual needs of white men, which is why so many white and black Americans are actually related as family. But there's an even more fundamental way to answer this question. Whiteness needs blackness to confirm that it is white. The concept of whiteness, the use of the word white to refer to a group of people, dates to the early 17th century and originates alongside the enslavement of Africans for transport to the New World. In Europe, the construct of a white race was one small part of the larger project of racial classification during the Enlightenment. The scientific division of humans into those who resembled animals and those who were capable, in Kant's terms, of transcendent rationality. Only in a country founded on a model of continuous immigration, assimilation, and geographic expansion did whiteness come fully into its own. Before there was an American nation, it was crucially necessary to have a term that connoted solidarity and power over and above national origin, culture, or language. To drill down into this history is to conclude that the role of blackness in the formation of the white ego is much more fundamental and more complicated than the words racism or race imply. When Dillard, as a young girl, performs a racist act toward a black woman she loves and then is chastised for it, she awakens to three separate groups of people in the world: black people, who she can never be; racist whites, who she is in danger of becoming; and non-racist whites, who she is supposed to be. She feels the power of the word, the label, but also the power of judgment. Using a racial word is dangerous and wrong, therefore it must have some special power or magic, but a magic that is forbidden. Power and goodness are associated with withholding the word, with not mentioning or acknowledging race at all. That this is a power that is obviously reserved only for white people. Judith Butler has argued for decades that melancholia, the absorption then rejection of the object, plays a key role in how a power consolidates itself around normative heterosexual identity. In Butler's formulation, heterosexuality emerges only after a primary homosexuality, attraction to the same, is rejected. Masculinity and femininity, she writes, emerge as the traces of an ungrieved and ungrievable love. This leads to a culture of gender melancholy in which envy, thwarted love becomes rejection, then subjection, then violence. And the melancholic operation becomes a way of understanding how power of all kinds operates. Dominant white identity in America operates melancholically, Chang writes in The Melancholy of Race, as an elaborate identificatory system based on psychical and social consumption and denial. Quote, both racist and white liberal discourses participate in this dynamic, albeit out of different motivations. The racists need to develop elaborate ideologies in order to accommodate their actions with official American ideals, while white liberals need to keep burying the racial others in order to memorialize them. Those who do not see the racial problem, or those who call themselves non-ideological, are the most melancholic of all. It would be reductive to say that Annie Dillard's isolation, from which she derives so much wonder and joy, can be limited to a diagnosis of racial melancholia. On the other hand, reading the narrative of an American childhood in the stages she herself carefully lays out, it's all but impossible to ignore the way in which love for and engagement with black people is taken up and then discarded, buried in her early memories. In one pivotal scene, the most significant moment in the book, Dillard makes this departure absolutely explicit. Quote, the Homewood section of Pittsburgh's Carnegie Library system was in a Negro section of town. This branch was our nearest library. Mother drove me to it every 2 weeks for many years until I could drive myself. I only very rarely saw other white people there. Beside the furthest wall, and under leaded windows set 10 feet from the floor, so that no human being could ever see anything from them, stood the last and darkest and most obscure of the tall nonfiction stacks, Negro History and Natural History. It was in natural history, in the cool darkness of a bottom shelf, that I found books like The Field Book of Ponds and Streams. When I checked out the Field Book of Ponds and Streams for the second time, I noticed the book's card. It was almost full. There were numbers on both sides. My hardy author and I were not alone in the world, after all. The people of Homewood, some of whom lived in visible poverty, on crowded streets among burned-out houses, they dreamed of ponds and streams. They were saving to buy microscopes. In their bedrooms, they fastened plankton nets. But their hopes were even more vain than mine, for I was a child, and anything might happen. They were adults living in Homewood. I no more expected anyone else on earth to have read a book I had read than I expected anyone else to have twirled the same blade of grass. I would never meet these Homewood people who were borrowing the Field Book of Ponds and Streams. The people who read my favorite books were invisible or in hiding underground. In The Psychic Life of Power, Judith Butler writes, power not only acts on a subject, but in a transitive sense, enacts the subject into being. Here, in real time, as it were, that process is taking place. Like so many writers-to-be, the young Annie Dillard enters the library, the vaulted marble edifice, to find a world that is both limitless and unthreatening, where she can wander freely and at ease. But a sacrifice has to take place first. Somehow she has to convince herself that the black people who, like herself, dreamed of ponds and streams are actually invisible or in hiding underground. Probably every fiction writer who has ever lived has realized that he or she prefers the company of imaginary people, living or dead. John Barth, in the last line of his classic short story Lost in the Funhouse, writes of his younger self, he wishes he had never entered the funhouse, but he has. Then he wishes he were dead, but he's not. Therefore, he will construct fun houses for others and be their secret operator, though he himself would rather be among the lovers for whom fun houses are constructed. But the pact Annie Dillard has made with herself, the pact so many white American writers have made, the pact I made with myself in my early 20s, is much more profound and particular than that. At this moment of artistic awakening, Annie Dillard has sealed off from herself both the secret and the public lives of Black people as a necessary step in achieving her own imaginative selfhood. What remains for her is a kind of detached feeling of troubled guilt and mourning and isolation that is not immediately locatable as a racial feeling, but it is one. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.